Okay. Um, Let me welcome all of you again. Our speaker this morning is Dr. Raphael Medoff, who is the founding director of the David S. Weinman Institute for Holocaust Studies and is the author of more than 20 books about the Holocaust, Zionism, and American Jewish history. He has taught Jewish history at Ohio State University, Purchase College of the State University of New York, and elsewhere. He is a fellow of the Finkler Institute of Holocaust Research at Bar Ilan University. And Dr. Medoff's recent article in the foreword comparing the Beijing Olympics to the Olympics in Nazi Germany inspired some significant and important conversation in the Jewish community. I know it certainly captured my attention and is what prompted my congregation to reach out to him. And I look forward to him sharing his thoughts on the subject with us today as the Winter Olympics in China come to a conclusion. Dr. Medoff, please.
Thank you, Rabbi Ellickberg, and thanks to Rachel Schertzer, your executive director, for all of your assistance in putting this program together and giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts with everyone about the Olympics, past and present. As you noted, today is the final day of the Winter Olympics in Beijing, China. And as I speak about these Olympics and the ones in Germany in 1936, I want to begin on a cautionary note. I am among those who are very reluctant to make comparisons between contemporary events and the Holocaust or Nazism. When my colleagues and I began the David Weinman Institute for Holocaust Studies back in 2003, the phenomenon of people comparing contemporary political figures and policies to Hitler and to Nazism was relatively new. And in those days, I wrote a number of articles bemoaning the tendency of pundits and others to reach for those Nazi analogies. After a while, these analogies became so prevalent in public discourse that in effect I gave up. There was no point in writing about it anymore because these Hitler analogies seem to come flying fast and furious almost every day. And yet, in our discussion today, I am going to be invoking the Nazi Olympics of 1936. And I want to explain why I am making this exception, and I'm going to be drawing certain comparisons. The problem with these Nazi analogies is that they both exaggerate whatever contemporary political figure or policy is being targeted, because for all the faults of various politicians and leaders today, none of them is Hitler or like Hitler in the real practical genocidal sense that we think of Hitler. And the other problem with the Nazi analogies is that they, in effect, cheapen or minimize the extent of what the Nazis did. Because if what the Nazis did is really comparable to some policy that we don't particularly like today, then it doesn't seem like the Nazis are so bad. So as a general rule, these analogies really misrepresent history. Where, in my view, do these comparisons become valid to any degree? Well, when the persecution or the persecutors today of whom we are speaking are in fact engaged in genocide or something close to genocide. At that point, then there's no danger that we are exaggerating the contemporary oppression or minimizing what Hitler did, because if it's genocide today, then it is genocide. And for that reason, I'm going to be reaching into this area that I normally avoid. The Olympics that were held in Germany in 1936 were scheduled for Berlin before Hitler came to power. So the International Olympic Committee, in choosing Berlin as its site, was not making any statement about German politics. But once the site had been picked, the International Olympic Committee stuck to it, even after Hitler and the Nazis rose to power in 1933. And thereupon began a movement in the United States and in other countries, but I'm going to be focusing on the United States, of opposition to the boycott, opposition to the Olympics, promoting the idea that there should be a boycott of the Olympic Games. Who were the opponents? Well, first and foremost, American Jewish organizations were almost united in urging the Roosevelt administration to boycott the Olympics and in making the case as to why it was inappropriate to have this prestigious international athletic event in Berlin with the Nazi regime in power. So American Jewish organizations led this boycott movement, but they were by no means the only participants in it. In fact, there were a number of prominent non-Jewish organizations, groups, movements, associations that also called for boycotting the games. And just to cite a couple of examples, the NAACP, the leading African-American civil rights organization, called for boycotting the games. And just as a side note here, of course, one of the things we remember most about the 1936 Olympics was the stellar performance of the African-American track star, Jesse Owens. And I'll speak more about him a little bit later, but Owens, in choosing to go to Berlin, was in fact defying the position of the leading Black civil rights group in the United States at the time, the NAACP. A number of other bodies and organizations also called for boycotting the Olympics. Church organizations, Protestant and Catholic, were not major players in this movement, although there were a few notable Christian, Protestant and Catholic advocates of a boycott. Major labor unions urged a boycott. And so there was what we might call a kind of a broad coalition of groups, Jews and non-Jews, who believed that the games should be boycotted. Generally speaking, the major issue that was raised by the advocates of a boycott was the persecution of the Jews in Germany. And let's pause here to recall what was the status of Jews in Germany at the time in 1935, 1936. This was, of course, years before the mass killing of the Jews began, what we call the Holocaust began. So this was years before genocide. It was also several years before Kristallnacht, the first nationwide pogrom against Jews in Nazi Germany. However, by 1935, 1936, Jews in Germany were being targeted by systematic government-sponsored persecution, which involved banning Jews from many professions, stripping Jews of their citizenship. That was promulgated at the infamous Nuremberg laws of 1935. A general ostracization of Jews from German society. We've all seen those infamous photos of park benches in Germany in the 30s with signs that said "No Jews allowed." So Jews were being pushed systematically out of German society, suffering from severe social and economic discrimination, and subjected to sporadic violence, small outbreaks here and there, but it had not yet reached the level of nationwide government organized violence. That was still several years away. Now, interestingly, one might say about the situation in China today that the persecution of the Muslim Uyghurs has actually already reached a level more severe than the period in Germany that we're talking about, because the persecution of the Uyghurs has been determined by the US State Department and by all the leading human rights organizations around the world as constituting genocide. And that's because the Chinese government's persecution of the Uyghurs includes mass forced sterilization, as well as mass detention in so-called re-education centers. So already in China, it has reached frightening proportions. And I just want to add one more note here. When I point out that the State Department has recognized the persecution of the Uyghurs as genocide, it's important to keep in mind that our State Department does not rush to use the term genocide. In fact, in certain cases, as in the Darfur genocide, the State Department was very slow and dragged its feet, while many other international bodies had already concluded that genocide was underway in Darfur in Sudan in the early 2000s, the State Department really took its time and was appropriately criticized, in my view, appropriately criticized by human rights groups for doing so. So when I point out that the State Department today has recognized the persecution of the Muslim Uyghurs in China as genocide, then we know that that's something that has to be taken very seriously. Now, back to Germany in 1935 and 1936. Opponents of the games, that is, advocates of boycotting the games, made several arguments. They argued in the general sense that Hitler was going to try to use the games as a way to legitimize his rule, to improve Germany's public image around the world, to make Germany seem more moderate and reasonable than it was, in fact. So this was an argument based on the practical consideration that having the games in Germany was, in fact, going to give the Nazis a major public relations boost. They also argued on a more technical ground, one that they hope would appeal to the International Olympic Committee's sense of rules and regulations. That is, that the German government was not permitting German Jewish athletes to compete to participate on the German team. So this was an argument going to the basic rules of Olympic preparation and participation, that in every country which wants to take part in the games, all athletes have to be given a fair chance at training, at preparing, and a fair chance to compete with the games, to take part in the games on behalf of their native country. I want to share with you a political cartoon. I want to share with you several political cartoons that appeared in the press at the time in early 1930s, which give you a sense of what people were talking about with regard to the game. So this first one is going to come from a famous Jewish political cartoonist by the name of Karl Rose. Karl Rose drew cartoons for the Jewish, you see in the top, it says Jewish Daily Bulletin. That was the daily newsletter issued by the Jewish Telegraph Agency, a major Jewish news service, kind of like we'd call it the Jewish Associated Press, which is still in operation today. And you see in Rose's cartoon, he has this giant ogre of a Nazi saying, "We're doing nothing to prevent him from entering the Olympics." And you see the German Jewish athlete, he has his hands tied, he has his feet chained, and you see on the two balls and chains at his feet, one says training restrictions. So that's referring to the fact, and the other one is exclusion from athletic clubs. So that's referring to the fact that German Jewish athletes were not allowed by the Nazi regime to use the same kind of training facilities and to prepare as non-Jewish German athletes. Now, the Germans were very sensitive about this growing boycott movement and the criticism being leveled at their policies in the preparation for the games. And Hitler was worried that the International Olympic Committee might act to move the games out of Berlin if athletes were not being allowed to compete fairly and equally. So the Germans decided to allow 2 token Jews to compete, quote unquote, along with other German athletes. Now, in one case, the athlete in question was a fencer by the name of Helene Mayer. The irony is Helene Mayer had fled Germany in 1935 because after the Nuremberg laws, she lost her citizenship. Helene Mayer's father was Jewish, her mother was not, but according to the Nuremberg laws, she was a Jew. She was racially a Jew, and stripped of her citizenship, as all German Jews were, and bereft of employment opportunities. She left Germany. She was living in Los Angeles, and when the German government contacted her and demanded that she return to Germany and compete with the non-Jewish German fencers to prove, so to speak, that the Nazis were being fair to German athletes, to German Jewish athletes. Mayer returned from Los Angeles, and it's not really hard to understand why. The rest of her family was still in Germany, and she was terrified that if she did not heed Hitler's summons, that they might be victimized. In fact, and she did ultimately compete in the games. In fact, there was a moment where she is seen on the athletes' platform, the winners' podium, giving the Nazi salute, and people were jarred by the sight of this woman who was, with a Jewish father who had been exiled from Germany, giving the salute. But she said later, not surprisingly, she said that she was afraid if she didn't play along as the Nazis expected, that her family might be, thrown into a concentration camp or murdered. So, of course, we can only feel a sense of pity for Helene Mayer's dilemma. The other Jewish athlete who was allowed to compete, so to speak, was a high jumper, a star high jumper by the name of Gretel Bergman. Her born name was Marguerite Bergman. She, in the competition, she actually scored the highest number, the highest rating for any of the German high jumpers, and yet she was disqualified from the team. So she was allowed to compete in the lead up to the game so that the German regime and German representatives could say, look, we're allowing this Jewish high jumper to compete, but her mark was not high enough. In fact, she got the highest mark, but they disqualified her because Hitler did not want a fully Jewish athlete competing. So ultimately, Helene Mayer, the so-called half-Jewish fencer, was the only one. So that's how the Germans tried to appease international opinion. Now, of course, this didn't fool anybody. It only fooled those who wanted to be fooled. And now I'm referring to Avery Brundage, the head of the International Olympic Committee, who was very friendly to the Nazi regime, and who was looking for any way to justify to the American public that the Germans should be allowed to host the games. And so Brundage cited Helene Mayer and Marguerite Bergman as proof that that people like that, cartoonists, were wrong. The German Jews are being allowed to compete also. I want to show you another political cartoon from the period, which helps illustrate the kind of public debate and opposition that was growing in the months leading up to the games. This very striking cartoon is by the famous artist and occasional political cartoonist William Gropper. This cartoon appeared in a prominent American communist publication. I want to comment briefly on the position of the communists. I mentioned that the boycott of the games was promoted by Jewish groups and a number of non-Jewish groups, labor unions, Black groups, and others. The communists were also very much in favor of boycotting the games. The position of the Soviet Union in 1936 was very hostile to Nazi Germany. So the American communist movement followed along, and all the various communist publications in the US in the 30s were actively promoting the boycott. Of course, as we know, a couple of years later, when Stalin decided that it would be more convenient and politically expedient to have an alliance with Nazi Germany, he went ahead and signed a pact with Hitler, and suddenly the communist movement in America completely changed, and everyone was in favor of the alliance with Germany. But 1936, the communists were still anti-Nazi, at least for a short time. And so this gave rise to one of the interesting footnotes in the history of the Olympics controversy. The recently elected socialist government in Spain announced that they would be hosting an alternative Olympics, a protest Olympics in Barcelona in 1936. And this proposal gained strong support of socialist and communist groups around the world, and athletes who were somewhat sympathetic to that political perspective. And it would have ultimately provided a very interesting contrast. But as we know, the Spanish Civil War erupted in the spring of 1936. So the entire project of this alternative protest Olympics ultimately never materialized. In the lead up to the Beijing Olympics in the last couple of months, we heard a number of protests, but I would not characterize what we witnessed as anything that I would call truly serious. There were a few ads in the newspapers. There were a number of organizations, but not many, that urged a boycott of the games. Sadly, I think, even though, as we know, the persecution of the Uyghurs has reached the level of genocide, nonetheless, there were really relatively few voices in the United States or around the world urging a boycott of the Beijing Olympics. That, of course, is, that's one of the great tragedies. When we look back at the Nazi period, the Holocaust era, of course, we focus on those events in part because we hope that today's international community will learn from the mistakes of the silence during those days, and not repeat that kind of indifference. The movement for boycotting the Olympics in Berlin in 1936 focused to a significant extent on trying to persuade the Roosevelt administration to boycott the games. Now, the United States government then and now does not directly control what the Olympic Committee or the individual athletes do, but it does have the power to make a significant difference. So what happened in 1936 is that the position of President Franklin Roosevelt and his administration was adamantly opposed to boycotting the games. The critics were hoping that the Roosevelt administration would send a message to the Nazis of international disapproval of Nazi policies by boycotting the games. But actually, President Roosevelt wanted to send a very different message. I pause here for a moment to emphasize that we remember FDR, most notably, of course, for leading America in World War II against Nazi Germany. But because of that focus, we tend to forget that the policy of the Roosevelt administration towards Nazi Germany before World War II was very different. FDR's policy in the 1930s was to maintain cordial, sometimes even friendly relations with Nazi Germany. This meant maintaining normal diplomatic relations. It meant participating in international events such as the Olympics, and it also significantly meant conducting a substantial amount of trade with Germany. American Jews and others favored a boycott, not only of the Olympics, but also a boycott of German goods that were being imported to the United States. There was a whole second parallel movement to the boycott of the Olympics, was the boycotting of stores that were carrying German goods. The Roosevelt administration was so determined to oppose any kind of a boycott of Nazi Germany that it permitted the Hitler regime to disguise the origins of many of the goods that it exported to the US so that consumers would not realize what they were buying. And what I mean by disguising is that the Germans were allowed to print on the labels of their goods, not made in Germany, but made in, and then they would have the name of a town in Germany where that particular product had been manufactured, a town that most Americans would not recognize as necessarily being in Germany. The Germans were also allowed to place the labels in such a way that they were physically very difficult to see at all. And in this way, the Germans, with the aid of our own government, evaded the boycott of their goods for a while. Eventually, Jewish activists in the US caught on and threatened to sue the administration, the Commerce Department. And at that point, the Germans were required to label their goods the same as everybody else. But I mentioned that by way of illustrating that the policy of the Roosevelt administration was to not boycott the Olympics and to send to the Germans a message that America wanted to have good relations with Germany. A large part of the motive of that policy was to avoid bringing America close to any kind of a conflict with Germany. As we know, the 1930s were the period of the Great Depression, terrible economic stress, high unemployment. Also a period of a strong isolationist sentiment. there was a very strong opposition among the American public to doing anything that would involve a conflict with the Germans. And so the administration resisted and opposed the movement to boycott the Olympic Games. Had the Roosevelt administration wanted to isolate and ostracize Nazi Germany, what the president could have done would have been something similar to what Jimmy Carter did in 1980, when he decided that the US was not going to participate in the Olympics, which were being held in Moscow because of the recent Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. So what President Carter did in 1980 was he announced that the position of the US government was to oppose participation in the games. What the government could do is it could deny visas to athletes to leave the US to go to Moscow. So it had that power. So although Roosevelt could not have directly ordered the International Olympic Committee or the American Olympic Committee, its US branch, to boycott the games, it could have in effect stood in the way of athletes going, but it chose not to. As a result, the overwhelming majority of athletes who had a chance to go to Germany decided to take part in the competition, the Olympic trials to qualify for the games. And ultimately, only a very small number, a real handful of American athletes who could have qualified for the games had the moral courage to stand up and say, no, we're not going to go. There's so few of them that I can almost mention all of them by name. Most of them were Jewish. Most of the boycotting athletes were Jewish, not all of them. Jack Shea, for example, a speed skater, was Catholic. But others, such as the track and field stars, Norman Canners and Milton Green, swimming coach Charlotte Epstein, and interestingly, the entire Long Island University College basketball team, the Blackbirds. And I mention them because in those days, college basketball, not professional basketball, college basketball was the main basketball league competition in the United States. The NBA was just in its infancy. And 1936, by the way, was the first year that basketball was an Olympic sport. So it was a particularly prestigious opportunity for college basketball players. They would be the first to represent America in basketball at the Olympics. The Long Island University Blackbirds were widely regarded as by far the best team in the United States. They had won something like more than 30 of their previous games in a row, and they were by an average margin of, I think, 24 points a game. They were just a powerful, overwhelming team. Some of the players on the Long Island University team were Jewish, some were not, but they voted as a team to refuse to take part in the tryouts because they said they could not, their consciences could not allow them to participate in Olympics in a country where the Jews were being persecuted. Among the other star athletes who boycotted the games was the track and field star from Tulane University, Herman Newgas. And I want to pause here to say that we are very honored to have as part of our program this morning, Herman Newgas' son, Richard, who I'd like to invite now to share a few recollections of his father and his own reflections on the significance of his father doing something that so few athletes were willing to do then, and sadly no athletes were willing to do this year with regard to the Beijing Games.
Hello, folks. Can everyone hear me? Good, good. I knew my father's story about the Olympics, very small portion. But in 1996, the U.S. Holocaust Museum mounted a special exhibit called the Nazi Olympics. And I was lucky to be invited. My father had passed, and I got to see the broader picture of the Olympics and the movements to boycott, etc. And at that time, I realized that Dad's position was unique. I had heard about Norman Connors and a few other Jewish athletes who said no, but my father's experience at that time was unusual and poignant. He did not say anything about his position to boycott or not, but he received from the AAU a letter with a self-addressed envelope saying, if you make the team, would you participate? Would you go to Berlin as a US athlete? And on that card were two boxes, yes or no. So he marked no and sent it in and told no one. In December, an athlete from LSU, a Jewish athlete, was asked, well, if you make the team, would you go? And his comment was, why, of course, Nugas is Jewish and he's going. My father read that in a letter to the editor of the Times-Picayune and felt he had to respond. So he wrote this letter, which got national recognition. My attention has just been directed to a press association dispatch recently appearing, in which I, a Jewish athlete, am quoted as wanting to participate in the Olympic Games to be held in Germany next year. As a matter of fact, because I felt that any expression from me might have been misconstrued, I have consistently refrained from making any statement whatever in the controversy. Since, however, my name's been mentioned in that connection, I felt constrained to state my position. I had hoped that early German pledges of non-discrimination among the athletes of that country would be kept. And if they had been, I would never have opposed American participation in Olympic contest in Germany. Although I personally would not have participated in such games in any country in which the fundamental principle of religious liberty is violated as flagrantly and as inhumanely as it has been in Germany. I have been advised on what I believe to be unimpeachable authority, which happened to be from Rabbi Stephen Wise, letting Dad know the reality, that the German pledges have not been kept under these circumstances. As an American citizen who believes sincerely in the cardinal tenet of freedom of religious worship embedded in the Constitution, I feel it to be my duty to express my unequivocal opinion that this country should not participate in the Olympic contests if they're held in Germany. In response to an inquiry from the committee in charge, I have already notified it that I will not participate in the Olympic Games next year. And that was that postcard that he sent in. Well, many of you know about the athletes Marty Glickman and Sam Stoller, who were trackmen who did go to the games. And the morning of the relay race, which they were expected to be part of the team, that morning, the head coach of the US named Jesse Owens and Ralph Metcalf, two outstanding runners, to replace them. And there have been controversy ever since about Brundage's influence on that decision, because he was clearly a Nazi, a friend of the Nazis. And I did an interview with Marty several years later in which he said, your dad made the right decision. Now, if he had been part of the relay, none of this would have come to public knowledge. So the lesson that I take as his son from all of that is that sometimes it is important to speak up.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you very much. And that leads me to the lessons from Beijing and Berlin. So let's start first of all with the lesson that we learned from the courageous athletes like Hermann Neugas, who refused to go to Berlin. This handful of men and women who passed up the opportunity for international renown, with all that might entail, they constitute a moral exemplar, role models, I would say, for young people today. And to that end, my colleagues and I, a few years ago, created a full-page political cartoon, which I want to briefly share with you now. This appeared in the Political Affairs Weekly, The New Republic. You can see the cartoon is called "They Refuse to Go." Hermann Neugas is one of those here. I created this together with the comic book artist Sal Amendola. We distribute these to teachers, and for those of you in the audience who are teachers or educators or who would be interested in getting a copy of this poster-size political cartoon, please contact me after the program. The importance of showing young people that there are those who stand up, even if it's a small minority, is in my view, one of the most important lessons from the Holocaust period. My institute, the David Weinman Institute for Holocaust Studies, is named after David Weinman, the author of the definitive work on America's response to the Holocaust, The Abandonment of the Jews. But Professor Weinman also emphasized that while the US government and many others abandoned the Jews, there were a minority in various fields, a minority of Americans who did speak up and who did try to draw attention to the plight of the Jews and the need to rescue them. So I want to, first of all, again, salute Hermann Neugas and those who stood up, those who refused to go. And I want to underline the fact that, that although no athletes boycotted this year's Olympics in Beijing, sadly, inevitably this controversy will return. Not the next time around. Our next host will be France for the next Olympic Games. But it's almost inevitable that at some point we will again be faced with the prospect of a totalitarian regime hosting the Olympics, hoping to exploit the Olympics. And again, athletes will face this moral dilemma. So by bringing out the story of those who boycotted 1936, I hope we can draw attention to the fact that you don't have to go, that sometimes making that moral statement is more important than anything else. From Hitler's perspective, the Berlin Games were a triumph. What he wanted to accomplish was to impress the international community and make himself seem more modern and reasonable than many people knew him to be. Now, we look back sometimes and in talking about the 1936 Olympics, we focus on the phenomenon of Jesse Owens, the track star Jesse Owens, winning those medals, and our sense that, well, he really showed Hitler because here was an African American, he was a black man, in effect defying all the Nazi racial superiority theories and stereotypes. And it was no doubt that Hitler was annoyed by the fact that a black man won those medals. But to a significant extent, that is how we look back with the benefit of hindsight. Because at the time, unfortunately, most of the press coverage, the American press coverage of the Berlin Olympics was very sympathetic. It was admiring, talking about what great hosts they were and what a spectacular event the Nazi regime had put on. And there were even major newspapers that speculated in their editorials that perhaps the spirit of the Olympics would now carry over into international affairs, and perhaps this was an omen that peace was on the way. Again, this was 1936. It was 3 years before Hitler launched World War II. But for those who were engaged in wishful thinking, who wanted to believe that somehow reasonable people would be, if they acted reasonably by participating in the games, that Hitler would be reasonable, well, we all know through too many tragic historical examples where that kind of thinking can lead. A couple of months after the Olympics in Germany, Rabbi Stephen Wise, who Richard mentioned, who was the most prominent American Jewish leader of that era, had a meeting with President Roosevelt in the White House. And what I'm about to describe comes from a memo that Wise wrote for his files, but this was not publicized at the time. Wise was meeting with the president to discuss various issues, including the plight of the Jews in Germany. And Roosevelt shared with him an anecdote. The president said that recently 2 American tourists who had been to Germany during the summertime and attended the Olympics and had, visited Berlin, had told FDR that they visited some synagogues, and the synagogues all seemed to be crowded with people. The Jews seemed to be worshiping freely, and it seemed that things were pretty good for the Jews. And President Roosevelt said to Rabbi Wise, so you see, according to these eyewitnesses, really looks like things aren't too bad. And Wise was beside himself that the president of the United States could be so apparently easily influenced. But when people want to believe things, as we know, they tend to believe them. Our president did protest the Beijing Olympics in a kind of a half-hearted way. As we know, President Biden imposed what he called a diplomatic boycott of the Beijing Games. Not a full boycott. A diplomatic boycott meant that American diplomats were not sitting next to China's leaders in the stands there and at other official events when the games opened. So in that sense, the US government did protest Beijing's persecution of the Uyghurs and other minorities, but it wasn't a full boycott because the president did not do what President Carter did in 1980. He didn't use the full moral power of the US government to discourage or prevent athletes from participating. So unfortunately, ultimately, this well-meaning gesture by President Biden really was not a substantive protest. And although the Chinese leaders were annoyed that the US was protesting it anyway, it didn't seem to have much effect on them. And I want to conclude with one word about the news media coverage of these games. As we know, NBC television was the broadcaster of the games. And at the opening ceremonies, the anchors, Savannah Guthrie and several others, made a very brief kind of a passing reference to the fact that the Chinese government is engaged in this persecution of the Uyghurs. And they did it by way of saying that US diplomats are not present at the opening ceremonies, and here's why. But they really only spent a few seconds referring to the persecution, and then that was it. Throughout the rest of the period of the games and leading right up until today's conclusion, the NBC just completely left the Uyghurs out, left out the whole subject of Chinese persecution, also of the Tibetans, Chinese oppression in Hong Kong, and so forth. So sadly, the news media led by NBC, and there were exceptions. There were some in the news media who did audibly protest the Beijing Games, but NBC, which really had the opportunity to turn a spotlight on this most important moral issue, instead chose to focus mostly on the lucrative business end of the arrangements. And for the same reason, major international companies, which were the sponsors of the games, refused to pull out, even though human rights groups had urged them to withdraw their sponsorship. Toyota and the many others who advertised on NBC during the games and who were listed as official sponsors. So to sum up, I have to say that as a historian, it seems to me that the international response to the Beijing Games and the Beijing persecution was largely a failure. There were exceptions, important exceptions, but overall, it saddens me to say that the lessons of Berlin 1936 have not been learned. Just as Hitler exploited the games back then, the Chinese leadership today, again, exploited the games to make themselves appear as respected international figures, part of the civilized international community. And that is something which really, from a moral perspective, should not have been allowed to pass. I'd like to take a few minutes now to open the floor to questions, also questions for Richard Newgas, if anyone has. And I'm happy to answer any questions as long as Rabbi Ellenberg tells us that we have time.
We definitely have some time. I'm just going to ask that if people would like to ask a question, to raise your hand, either virtually or otherwise, so we can sort of keep a measure of order in the process. And while people are doing that, can I abuse my power as host to ask the first question?
Please.
So to what degree can we bring influence and pressure to bear on the IOC so as to preclude putting the athletes who have invested Herculean efforts to get to where they are from being put on the horns of this really difficult moral dilemma, which their governments and international agencies seem all too eager to avoid?
I don't know if there's any way to keep the athletes from being caught in the middle, so to speak. And let me emphasize that I have the greatest respect for all the athletes who are competing and for those who participated, although I regret their decision to participate. Nonetheless, they obviously have worked for many years to excel in their chosen fields. And it's sad, it's a shame that that they should have been put in this dilemma. Nonetheless, it's my view that as every individual human being has ultimately a moral responsibility in matters of life and death that has to outweigh everything else. Still, the ideal way to avoid the athletes being put in that situation would be if the International Olympic Committee would refrain from awarding the games to totalitarian regimes. But the reason that's not a perfect solution is illustrated by what happened with Berlin. When Berlin was chosen as the site for the 1936 Olympics, it was a democratic government. They could not anticipate that this evil regime would rise to power. So sometimes there's no way to avoid it. But on the other hand, there are many instances in which it can be avoided. So first of all, pressure can be put on the International Olympic Committee even now in an ongoing basis to urge it not to award future games to totalitarian regimes. That would be one way to head off the dilemma. But if in the end, the games are awarded to a country which then finds itself ruled by a regime engaged in persecution, then ultimately I would say the athletes have no choice but to stand up as Herman Newgas and the others did in 1936 and say simply, no, I am not going to help bring legitimacy to an evil regime.
Okay, thank you. And Deb and Joel seem to have their hand up, so if they unmute.
Okay. Richard, thank you very much for sharing your story with us, and it was very enlightening. And I was wondering if the substitution of Jesse Owens for the two Jewish athletes, if that was contemplated and planned in advance, or if the U.S. Olympic team succumbed to pressure from the Nazis when they were finally there and looked at Jesse Owens as a potential real embarrassment for the Nazis.
Excellent question. In the voyage to Berlin on the USS Manhattan, the two Jewish runners, Glickman and Stoller, were the only ones practicing the baton toss. So there was no indication that, well, maybe someone else can take their place. There was a tradition, not a rule, that in the trials, the first three top runners would run in the individual races, and the other four would run in the relay. So everyone, including the sports press, assumed that the Glickman and Stoller would be part of the relay. And it was a surprise to everyone that morning in the room where the coach announced who would run. Everyone was relatively shocked. And Marty Glickman said, but coach, you said that the Germans are hiding some secret runner that will change the results. And the coach pointed at, I'm sorry, it was Jesse Owens who said that. And he pointed at Owens and said, you be quiet, I'm the coach. So that, I think, added to the belief that it was influenced by someone else.
Okay, thank you.
Both. Any other last questions for either of our guests this morning? In that case, I'm going to thank Dr. Madoff for giving us much food for thought for the next 2, 4, and many more years as the Olympics continue to unfold. I want to thank Mr. Newgas for joining us and sharing a little bit about his father and his father's courage. And I want to thank everyone for taking some time this morning to reflect with us on this very, very significant question and issue that was raised by the most recent Olympics. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
All right.
Thank you.